So throughout most of the month of June, the British are burning papers in Cairo in anticipation of a possible German takeover. As a Second World War broke out in Europe and beyond, Egyptians were divided about who they might support. Many chafed, of course, under British domination and saw the Italians and the Germans as potential liberators. These were buoyed up by a constant stream of Italian fascist propaganda beamed into Egypt from Libya and Ethiopia and spread by the tens of thousands of Italians living here. Other Egyptians feared that by kicking the British out, they'd simply be trading one undesirable ruler for another one, and possibly a worse one. To curry favor with the Egyptians, and with the Arabs in general, in May 1939, the British government issued a white paper limiting Jewish migration to Palestine, an increasingly hot-button topic in the region. Most Egyptians surely preferred out-and-out independence, or at least neutrality during the war, but it was clear this was not going to happen. Egyptians would have to pick a side. Well, the choice was essentially made for them throughout 1939 and 1940, as Egypt was turned into something of a great military base for British troops and troops from all over the empire, the Commonwealth. Indians, Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, plus Free French forces. The Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 had limited the number of British troops in Egypt to just 10,000, but only during peacetime. That was the caveat, only during peacetime. That number could increase indefinitely during war. With so many Allied troops stationed in Egypt, any hope that some Egyptians might have had of declaring Egyptian neutrality went out the window, and Egypt became a target of the Italian and ultimately German war machines. The Egyptians had long admired British might, so it was a surprise to see Britain pushed to the brink as the war progressed. But no country was as admired by the Egyptians as much as France was. So to hear of France's rapid fall to the Wehrmacht in 1940, that sent shockwaves across Egypt. Then on June 10th, Mussolini's Italy declared war on France and Britain. To secure Egypt, British forces preemptively invaded Italian Libya and captured a fort just across the border along the Mediterranean coastline. The Italians responded by pushing 60 miles into Egypt and capturing the town of Sidi Barrani. Now, their original goal had been to go much further, past Alexandria all the way to the Suez Canal, to seize it. Coinciding, the timing of that was meant to coincide with the German invasion of Britain. But when the German invasion of Britain never materialized, Italian aims were readjusted, and the push to Sidi Barrani was made. There, the Italians threw up a number of forts and hunkered in. In December of 1940, the British struck back, defeating the entrenched Italians and quickly pushing them out of Egypt altogether. Taking advantage of their victory, the British pushed on, capturing several coastal positions in eastern Libya and killing, capturing, or otherwise destroying most of the Italian army. In this case, we're talking about the Italian 10th Army in the region. This was a disaster for Italy, and it motivated Hitler to issue Directive Number 22 for German forces to support the Italians in North Africa. Thus it was that the Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, who would become known as the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, made its way from Naples in February 1941 to Libya to carry out Operation Sunflower. Now, British intelligence underestimated Rommel's ability to mount a serious offensive here in North Africa, and everyone from Winston Churchill to Middle East Commander-in-Chief Archibald Wavell apparently listened to that intelligence. Wavell in particular was operating on the assumption that the British could take care of the Germans the way that they'd taken care of the Italians. In fact, some of the Allied forces here were even reassigned to the Greek and Syrian fronts. But they were all wrong. Rommel was not to be underestimated, either in terms of ability or in terms of audacity. See, by the end of March, the now combined German-Italian force had pushed all the way to El Akela, about 175 miles down the coast from Benghazi. Then, 30 to 40 miles past it, the British now began to retreat up the coast toward Benghazi, but many of their tanks gave out, and in the end, they were forced to give up Benghazi and retreat further east. All this happened in a matter of days, by the way. And despite logistical challenges, notably in the water and fuel departments, Rommel kept coming, moving 100, then 200 miles past Benghazi along the coastline. Within a week of Benghazi's capture, already staring down at Tobruk, eastern Libya's only deep-water port. The Germans would need to capture Tobruk if they hoped to mount a successful assault on Egypt. And it was just much, much closer to Alexandria or the Suez than, say, Benghazi or Tripoli. I mean, look at a map of Libya sometime. Look at how long that coastline is in terms of miles. This is a very, very long desert coastline. Okay, distance matters here. Supply chains matter. And so the Germans settled in, beginning on April 10th, for a siege. Meanwhile, Rommel divided his forces and continued his rapid push east, reaching the Libyan-Egyptian border only 4 days after initiating the siege on Tobruk. Back in Tobruk, Allied defenses, we're talking here mostly troops of the 9th Australian Division, held for months. In fact, the German siege is going to last for 241 days. 241 days. April 10th to November 27th, 1941. In fact, so entrenched were the city's defenders that they soon came to be called the Rats of Tobruk, with their motto, "No surrender." The Rats of Tobruk repelled multiple Axis attacks and withstood brutal air attacks to boot, with some help from RAF planes based in Egypt. Axis ships tried to enforce a blockade of Tobruk, but Allied ships on several occasions managed to break through with supplies and with reinforcements, many of them Polish and Czech soldiers. At the same time, the Allies launched Operation Crusader, bypassing many of Rommel's coastal defenses near the Libya-Egypt border and making straight for Tobruk and environs. By early December, Rommel was forced to abandon Tobruk, a great loss. He falls back about 50 miles west to Gazela. A week later, Axis forces withdrew from Al-Aqaila, and a few weeks after that, the Allies were taking the marooned German positions near the Egyptian border. But Rommel struck back before January was out, surprising the Allies and driving them back to Gazela. Both sides now regrouped for the coming showdown, the Battle of Gazela, from May 26th to June 21st. Unfortunately for the Allies, the battle ended when Rommel finally conquered Tobruk, which of course is a devastating loss in terms of morale for the Allies, to say nothing of Tobruk's strategic importance, now lost as well. This is probably, by the way, Rommel's greatest victory, the taking of Tobruk. But the Desert Fox didn't stop there. He now pursued the Allies east all the way into Egypt. The expectation was that he would regroup and rest in Tobruk, but instead he went right on pursuing the Allies. In fact, his advance was only stopped here at El Alamein. Back then this was just a nondescript railway station 70 miles west of Alexandria. Here the Allies had established defenses, and you had the Qattara Depression preventing the Axis from outflanking them, which is what they always seemed to do. This, by the way, is what's left of that World War II era railway station. Not much. It'll probably be torn down any day. El Alamein. So throughout most of the month of June, the British are burning papers in Cairo in anticipation of a possible German takeover, while Rommel is driving his exhausted forces east toward this position, reaching El Alamein on June 30th, 1942. But the Allies were ready this time, and Rommel was increasingly suffering from supply chain issues. After lots of back and forth over 2 weeks, the Allies had suffered over 160,000 casualties, including over 13,000 killed. On the Axis, another 105,000 casualties, including around 10,000 killed. And Rommel had failed to advance past El Alamein. So he was stopped here. In fact, this first battle of El Alamein even saw Rommel put on the defensive. With Rommel stymied for the next couple of months, the Allies built up a formidable force to throw at him. Their subsequent clash, the second and third, or just second battle of El Alamein, depending on which history you read, but their subsequent clash here at El Alamein would change the course of World War II, and possibly world history. By the middle of October, the Allies not only enjoyed clear air superiority, but were also in a position to deploy twice the number of tanks and troops available to Rommel. Rommel knew this and laid thousands and thousands of mines, meant for people, meant for tanks, between him and his approaching enemy. His hope was that the Germans would emerge victorious at Stalingrad. And this is important to understand when it comes to the North African campaign. He hoped the Germans would emerge victorious at Stalingrad, then head south to threaten the Middle East, so coming from the north, forcing a diversion of Allied troops in his favor. Of course, his ultimate goal is to see his own forces victorious in North Africa and then continue their conquest into the Middle East from the south, meeting up with the similarly victorious German forces. So that's sort of the overarching strategy here. But lots had to go right for the Germans for such an outcome. And the Allies facing them here in Egypt were determined to fight tooth and nail to make sure it did not happen. When the Allied attack finally came on the night of October 23rd, British minesweepers did their best to clear Rommel's minefields. Meanwhile, artillery is raining down on the German-Italian position. But Axis defenses held, and the Axis counterattacks were fierce. More and more Allied tanks were knocked out of action. But Allied infantry, notably units from Australia and New Zealand, broke through the Axis line. Almost 10,000 Axis troops died in the fighting, along with almost 5,000 Allied ones. But by November 2nd, Rommel was relaying news to Hitler that the Battle of El Alamein had been lost. Hitler denied Rommel permission to retreat, but Rommel retreated anyway, the Germans leaving the Italians, who were short of automobiles, high and dry. The British made quick work of them, though they were slow to pursue the Germans, and thus Rommel and company were able to beat their retreat relatively unharmed, leaving a trail of wreckage, mines, and booby traps in their wake. The Allied victory here at El Alamein crushed Hitler's hopes of winning North Africa, hopes that were further dashed 2 weeks later when the Allies carried out their first major amphibious assault of the war, Operation Torch. 65,000 troops landing at various points in Algeria and Morocco. These are mostly Americans, by the way, commanded by Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, so that's important. That's important for later. The Americans, of course, had wanted to blaze a trail, cowboy-like, Civil War-like, all the way to Berlin. But instead, they'd been redirected to North Africa, and they're going to play a critical role here post El Alamein. But by the end of 1942, early 1943, you have Rommel in Tunisia, trapped essentially, because you've got that army of mostly Americans oncoming from the west. You've got the British/Commonwealth forces oncoming from the east. And it doesn't help him, of course, that all along, pretty much, the Allies have been able to read his messages. They've been able to intercept his messages, and they've cracked the code so they can read it all. Huge frustration for Rommel throughout this whole campaign. In any case, he's trapped in Tunisia. By March 1943, he's fled to Germany, and he'll never come back to Africa. 2 months later, May 1943, we see the formal Axis surrender in North Africa, essentially turning Rommel's erstwhile army into a 250,000 prisoners of war. So pretty major stuff. Now, the victory here, the victory in North Africa by the Allies, turns the Mediterranean behind me into an Allied lake. It opens it up to Allied traffic completely. And it opens up Southern Europe. It makes Southern Europe vulnerable to invasion. In fact, that's what's going to come next. The Americans will now be redirected to Italy. So huge in terms of the course of the war, the victory here in North Africa. In fact, some would say that besides giving the Americans their first serious taste of blood, besides stymieing Hitler's plans for a takeover of the Middle East, besides damaging in terms of morale as well as, men and material, Hitler's military, the victory here at El Alamein, the victory in North Africa, at the end of the day, combined with the Allied victory at Stalingrad, the Allied victory here in North Africa turned the tide of the war. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate that. If you want me to keep creating content like this, consider becoming my patron over on patreon.com. Also follow me on Instagram, where weekly I issue updates as well as a set of history challenges, a little more engagement there. It's a lot of fun. We'll see you there.